They called her Dusty behind her back. Not with affection, but with the casual cruelty reserved for things deemed old, slow, and in the way. At Mercy General Hospital in Chicago, a gleaming monument to modern medicine, Nurse Sarah Miller was an anachronism. A ghost from a bygone era of nursing, lost in the chaotic, high-tech ballet of the Level 1 Trauma Center. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the younger residents to the brink of madness. Her small, almost frail frame, barely 5'3", was always draped in oversized grey scrubs that seemed to swallow her whole. Greying blonde hair was perpetually pulled back into a severe, unfashionable bun that exposed the fine, web-like lines etched around her eyes and mouth. She looked less like a trauma nurse and more like a librarian who had taken a grievously wrong turn and ended up in a war zone. Her hands were the subject of the most vicious gossip. They possessed a faint, almost imperceptible rhythmic tremor. It was not the violent shake of a drunkard or the frantic tremble of fear, but a steady, quiet hum of dysfunction. Dr. Preston Sterling, the chief surgical resident, had actually placed a $500 bet in the residence lounge that Sarah Miller wouldn't last another month. He was fond of saying her hands shook more than a chihuahua in a hurricane. Dr. Sterling was everything Sarah was not. He was 32, carved from marble and ego, with the sharp jawline of a movie star and the condescending smirk of a man who had never been told no. The son of an influential Illinois senator, he wore his pristine white coat not as a uniform, but as a mantle of royalty. His stethoscope was draped around his neck like a piece of expensive jewelry, its bell rarely touching a patient's chest. He moved through the emergency department like a prince touring his domain, his voice loud, his pronouncements final, his sycophantic entourage of junior residents and young nurses trailing in his wake. The fluorescent lights of the trauma bay hummed with an aggressive, sterile brightness, reflecting off the polished stainless steel and the linoleum floors that smelled perpetually of antiseptic and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. It was Friday night, and the relentless Chicago rain hammered against the thick, wire-meshed windows of the emergency entrance. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, stale coffee, and the low-grade simmering anxiety that was the ER's natural state. Sarah was restocking a crash cart, her movements methodical. She checked each ampule, each packet of gauze, each laryngoscope blade, her lips moving silently as she cross-referenced the contents with the checklist on her clipboard. Her bad knee, a souvenir from what she vaguely described as a training accident years ago, popped audibly as she bent down to check the lower shelves. "For God's sake, Miller, are you taking inventory for an audit or stocking a cart?" Dr. Sterling's voice boomed across the bay. He stood by the central nursing station, smoothing the lapels of his white coat, a gesture he performed with obsessive frequency. A few of the younger nurses, including a pretty blonde named Brittany Moore, giggled. Sarah didn't look up. "Just ensuring everything is present and not expired, doctor," she said, her voice quiet, almost raspy. It was a voice accustomed to being ignored. Sterling strode over, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the clean floor. He loomed over her, a mountain of arrogance casting a shadow on her small form. "I watched you check that same cart 20 minutes ago. Are we experiencing a time loop, or is the short-term memory finally starting to go?" He winked at Brittany, who blushed and looked at her shoes. "Protocol is to re-verify after each use, doctor." "Cart 3 was used for the cardiac arrest in Trauma 2, Sarah replied, her tone even. She refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on the expiration date of a pack of sterile gloves. "The patient was pronounced an hour ago," Sterling scoffed, snatching the clipboard from her hands. He glanced at it with theatrical disdain. "We can't have our patients dying of preventable conditions because Grandma here is too busy counting bandages to actually respond to a call." He tossed the clipboard onto the cart with a clatter. "You're on restocking duty for the rest of the shift, all the bays. And when you're done with that, the linen closets on the 3rd floor need organizing. Try to keep up." He turned and walked away, the small crowd of his admirers parting before him. Sarah watched him go, her expression unreadable. The tremor in her hand seemed to momentarily worsen, a subtle vibration of tightly controlled fury. She took a slow, deep breath, the air tasting of bleach and defeat. She picked up the clipboard, her movements once again slow and deliberate. Brenda Thompson, the charge nurse, watched the exchange from her desk. Brenda was a woman in her late 50s, built like a dock worker, with arms that had seen more than their fair share of heavy lifting, both literal and metaphorical. She had survived pandemics, budget cuts, and 3 hospital-wide strikes. Her patience for incompetence, especially the arrogant kind, was non-existent. She didn't like Sterling, but she also didn't understand Sarah. The woman was a mystery, a competent but infuriatingly passive presence. "You just going to let him talk to you like that, Miller?" Brenda asked, her voice a low growl. Sarah finally looked up, her grey eyes meeting Brenda's. For a fleeting second, there was something in them that wasn't tired or submissive. It was hard, like forged steel. Then it was gone. "He's the chief resident, Brenda," she said softly. "It's his floor." "It's my floor until the shift change," Brenda grumbled, turning back to her monitor. "And I don't like bullies." But she didn't intervene. In the rigid hierarchy of the hospital, a chief resident with a senator for a father outranked a charge nurse with a mortgage and 20 years on the job. Sarah simply nodded and moved to the next cart, her limp seeming more pronounced than before. She ignored the whispers and the pitying glances. She just did her work. She was a ghost after all, and ghosts were meant to be unseen, unheard, and ultimately forgotten. The weight of the humiliation settled on her shoulders, another layer of armor she had learned to carry. She focused on the task, on the clean, logical order of the medical supplies. It was a small, controllable world in the midst of the chaos, a refuge from the noise and the condescension. She was just a tired old nurse, trying to protect her pension, trying to survive until she could finally afford to disappear for good. An hour later, Sterling was holding court in Trauma Bay 1, diagnosing a patient who had come in with a deep laceration to his forearm from a construction accident. The man was pale and sweating, his blood pressure alarmingly low. "Classic hypervolemic shock from blood loss," Sterling announced to the residents gathered around him. "We need to get 2 large-bore IVs in him and start hanging blood, get the wound packed and call ortho for a consult." Sarah was passing by, pushing a heavy linen cart. She glanced at the patient, then at the monitor. She paused for a fraction of a second. The man's vitals were wrong for simple blood loss. His neck veins were distended, and his trachea, if you looked closely, seemed to be shifted slightly to the left. She could see the faint puffiness of subcutaneous emphysema spreading across his upper chest. She had seen it 100 times before, in the dust and chaos of places Sterling couldn't even imagine. She approached the bay, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Dr. Sterling," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Miller? Did you run out of pillowcases to fold?" "His breath sounds, doctor," she said, her eyes fixed on the patient's chest. "Have you checked them? And his trachea? It looks deviated." Sterling's face flushed with anger. He was being questioned publicly by the one person in the hospital he considered beneath contempt. "I have made my diagnosis, Nurse Miller. It's blood loss. He works with power saws. Are you suggesting he spontaneously developed a pulmonary embolism while cutting drywall?" "No, doctor," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of urgency. "I think he has a tension pneumothorax. Maybe a broken rib punctured his lung when he fell." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A tension pneumothorax? Based on what, your sixth sense? I don't see any penetrating trauma to the chest. You're a nurse. You stock carts. You do not diagnose. Now get out of my trauma bay." "But his pressure." "Out!" Sterling bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Or I will have security escort you out of this hospital for good." Sarah froze. Every eye in the bay was on her. She saw the mix of pity and scorn on the faces of the residents. She saw Brittany Moore look away, embarrassed for her. She looked at the patient, whose lips were now tinged with a faint violet hue. Then she looked back at Sterling, whose ego was now a more immediate patient than the man dying on the gurney. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Yes, doctor." She turned and walked away, the squeak of the linen cart's wheels sounding unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent bay. She didn't see the young resident, David Park, hesitantly place his stethoscope on the patient's right chest. She didn't see his eyes go wide with alarm. "Dr. Sterling," Park stammered. I don't hear any breath sounds on the right side." Sterling's face went pale. He snatched a stethoscope and listened, his confident facade crumbling for a split second. The silence on the right side of the chest was absolute. He had been wrong. The old nurse had been right. He looked up, his eyes scanning the ER for Sarah, a toxic mix of fury and humiliation twisting his features. She was gone. He had nearly killed a man out of sheer arrogance, and the one person who tried to stop him was the woman he had just publicly destroyed. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly less certain. "All right," he said, trying to reclaim his authority. "Change of plans. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now!" The team scrambled, and the hiss of air escaping the patient's chest a moment later was a sound of both salvation and condemnation. Sarah heard it from down the hall, where she was methodically folding towels, her hands shaking not from nerve damage, but from the effort of holding herself together. Quick pause. If this story is making your blood boil at the injustice Sarah faced, show your support by hitting the like button below. Trust me, the karma that's coming for Dr. Sterling is absolutely worth waiting for. Now, let's continue. The rest of the shift descended into a miserable, grinding routine. Sarah methodically worked her way through Sterling's punitive list of chores. She restocked every supply closet, organized every linen cart, and even wiped down the stainless steel surfaces of the empty morgue gurneys. Each task was a small physical act of submission, a way to channel the cold rage that had settled deep in her gut. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her whenever he passed. His gaze a palpable thing, filled with a new kind of venom. He hadn't just been proven wrong. He had been proven wrong by her. It was a stain on his immaculate reputation, and he was determined to make her pay for it. Big Mike, one of the older security guards, found her in the supply annex, wrestling with a large box of saline bags. Mike was a mountain of a man, a former college football player in his early 60s whose imposing frame housed a gentle, observant soul. He knew everyone's name, remembered their birthdays, and often shared his thermos of coffee with the night shift staff. "Rough night, Dusty?" he asked, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He was one of the few who used the nickname with something approaching kindness. Sarah managed a weak smile. "They're all rough, Mike. You know that." He effortlessly lifted the box and placed it on the top shelf for her. "I saw what happened with Sterling, and with that construction worker. You were right. Doesn't matter if you're right when you're not the one wearing the long white coat," she said, her voice flat. She leaned against the metal shelving, the bad knee throbbing in protest. "It matters to that guy," Mike said, nodding back towards the ER. "It matters to his family. You did a good thing." "And got put on permanent latrine duty for it," she sighed, rubbing her temples. The tremor in her hands was a constant, frustrating companion. "He's going to find a way to get rid of me, Mike. I know it." "Let him try," the big guard said, a protective glint in his eye. "He'll have to go through a few of us first." He patted her shoulder gently, his huge hand nearly enveloping it. "You just keep your head down. This shift is almost over." But the shift was not almost over. Not even close. It happened at 2:17 a.m., the witching hour, when the hospital was at its quietest and most vulnerable. There wasn't an alarm. There was just a sound of immense, shattering violence. Crash! The double-paned, reinforced glass doors of the ambulance bay didn't just break. They exploded inward, a shower of tempered glass and twisted metal flying across the waiting area. A woman screamed. A rolling IV pole clattered to the floor. Through the mangled frame stepped a man. He was enormous, well over 6'5", with the physique of a professional wrestler packed into a sweat-soaked t-shirt and jeans. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated to black pools of madness, and his skin was slick with a sheen of sweat despite the cold night. A thick, bloody gash ran across his forehead, and he was holding a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. "Where is she?" he bellowed, his voice a raw, primal roar that echoed through the cavernous space. "Where is my sister? Where is Jessica?" Big Mike was the first to react. He moved with a speed that belied his age and size, putting himself between the man and the terrified patients in the waiting area. "Sir, you need to put the knife down," Mike said, his voice firm but calm, his hand hovering over the radio on his belt. "Let's talk about this. What's your sister's name?" The man didn't seem to hear him. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of rage and delirium. "They're hurting her. I heard her screaming. Code Silver! Code Silver! Emergency department!" Brenda's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the chaos over the hospital's intercom system. "Lockdown procedures initiated." The giant lunged. He didn't push Mike. He threw him. The security guard, all 260 pounds of him, was lifted off his feet and hurled into a bank of plastic chairs with a sickening crunch. He collapsed to the ground, groaning, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Panic erupted. Nurses and orderlies scrambled for cover. Patients who were able screamed and tried to run. Dr. Sterling, who had been charting at the main desk, simply froze. His face, usually a mask of arrogant composure, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The prince was a coward. The armed man stomped into the main thoroughfare of the ER, his head swiveling, the knife held in a white-knuckled grip. "Jessica!" Sarah had been in the linen closet down the hall when the doors shattered. She didn't run away. She ran towards the sound. It was an instinct carved into her soul by years of responding to explosions and gunfire. She peered around the corner, her mind a whirlwind of tactical assessment. One hostile, armed with a blade, multiple non-combatants, one friendly down. She saw Big Mike on the floor, clutching his leg. She saw the sheer animalistic power of the attacker. She saw his dilated pupils, the profuse sweating, the irrational strength, excited delirium, probably meth or PCP induced. This man was a powder keg, impervious to pain, running on pure adrenaline and psychosis. And then she saw him grab Brittany Moore. The young nurse had been trying to help a patient into a wheelchair and was caught in the open. The giant's arm shot out and wrapped around her neck, pulling her back against his massive chest. The blade of the hunting knife pressed against the soft skin of her throat. Brittany let out a choked, terrified squeal. "Everybody back!" the man screamed, his voice cracking. "You're all going to die. They killed her, and now you're all going to die." Sterling finally found his voice, but it was the wrong one. "Security! Tase him! Somebody tase him!" he shrieked from behind the relative safety of the nursing station. "You tase him, you kill her," Sarah muttered under her breath. The electrical current would cause his muscles to contract uncontrollably. That knife would slice through Brittany's throat before he even hit the floor. This was it. The moment of decision. Her career, her pension, the quiet, anonymous life she had so desperately tried to build, versus the life of the young woman who had laughed at her expense just hours before. It wasn't even a choice. She stepped out from behind the corner. The stooped, tired old nurse was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared. The limp was gone, replaced by a balanced, predatory stance, her weight on the balls of her feet. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. The tremor in her hands had vanished, replaced by an absolute lethal stillness. She began to walk forward, not with the slow, shuffling gait of before, but with the fluid, deliberate economy of movement of an operator. Each step was silent, measured. She moved not towards the man, but at an angle, making herself a less direct target, changing the tactical geometry of the room. "Let her go," Sarah said. Her voice was unrecognizable. The quiet, raspy whisper was gone. This was a voice of command, a low-pitched baritone that cut through the noise and fear like a razor. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority that made everyone, the attacker, the staff, even Sterling, freeze. The giant's wild eyes snapped to her. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. "I'm the person who's going to help you," Sarah said, her eyes never leaving his. She kept her hands open and visible, palms forward, a universal sign of non-aggression. "I hear you. You're looking for your sister, Jessica. I can help you find her, but you have to let your friend go first." She took another slow step forward. "She's not my friend," he roared, tightening his grip. Brittany wheezed, her face turning a deep, mottled red. "You're all my enemies. You're with them." "There is no them," Sarah said calmly, her gaze flicking from his eyes to the hand holding the knife, to the tension in his shoulders, to the placement of his feet. She was reading him like a book. "There is just you and me and a lot of scared people. Your sister, is she a patient here?" "They brought her in, an overdose. They said they were helping her, but I heard her screaming." Tears started to stream down his face, mixing with the sweat and blood. "They're killing her in here." "Okay," Sarah said, her voice softening slightly, becoming almost hypnotic. "Okay, I understand. You're scared for her. You love her. You want to protect her. I get that. I can take you to her. But I can't do that while you're holding that knife to that girl's throat. You see the problem, right?" She was now less than 10 feet away. Sterling, from his hiding spot, seemed to realize what was happening. "Miller, what are you doing? Get back. That's an order." Sarah didn't even flinch. She didn't acknowledge his existence. For her, he wasn't in the room. There was only the target, the hostage, and the mission. The man was wavering, his psychotic rage being pierced by Sarah's relentless calm. He was confused. He had expected screams, panic, violence. He had not expected this small, quiet woman who spoke to him like he was a reasonable human being. You're lying," he stammered, but his conviction was fading. The knife trembled in his hand. "I have never lied to a man in your situation," Sarah said, and it was the absolute truth. "My name is Sarah. What's your name?" "Tom," he mumbled. "Okay, Tom. Here's what we're going to do," she said, taking one more deliberate step. She was now just outside the arc of the knife. "You're going to lower the knife. Then you're going to let the girl go. She's going to walk away, and then you and I are going to go find Jessica together. That's the plan. Simple, easy. Can you do that for me, Tom?" He stared at her, his mind a battlefield of paranoia and a desperate need to believe her. For a heartbeat, it seemed to be working. His arm relaxed a fraction of an inch. The knife dipped, and then a rookie police officer, having just arrived, burst through a side door. "Freeze! Drop the weapon!" he yelled, his gun drawn and shaking. It shattered the spell. Tom's head snapped towards the new threat, and his rage returned in a tidal wave. "No! Tricked me!" he screamed, and the knife came up again, pressing hard against Brittany's throat. A thin line of red appeared on her skin. There was no more time for talk. Sarah exploded into motion. It wasn't a run. It was a lunge, an explosive burst of power that seemed impossible from her small frame. In a single, fluid movement, she closed the remaining distance. She didn't go for the knife hand. That was what he would expect. Instead, her left hand shot out, not in a punch but with fingers rigid, and jabbed hard into the pressure point at his mandibular angle, just below his earlobe. Thump. An arc of pure blinding white pain shot through Tom's skull. His head snapped back involuntarily, his jaw going slack with a grunt of agony. For a split second, his entire body seized. In that infinitesimal window of opportunity, Sarah's right hand, the one with the tremor, was a blur. It wasn't shaking now. It was a scalpel. She grabbed the wrist of his knife hand, not to pull it away, but to twist it inward, using his own strength and momentum against him. There was a sharp, wet crack as the bones in his wrist gave way. The knife clattered to the floor. Simultaneously, she dipped her shoulder, stepping inside his guard, and drove her elbow directly into his solar plexus. The air rushed out of his lungs in a massive whoosh. His giant body, starved of oxygen and still reeling from the nerve strike, went limp. She didn't let him fall. She pivoted, hooking her leg behind his, guiding his collapse. It wasn't a throw, it was a controlled descent. He crumpled to the floor like a felled tree, wheezing and semi-conscious, but alive. Brittany stumbled forward, gasping and sobbing, clutching her throat. Sarah gently pushed her towards Brenda, who had emerged from cover and now stared, white-faced, at the scene. "Get her checked out," Sarah commanded. She didn't spare the downed man a second glance. Her focus immediately shifted. "Big Mike," she called out, already moving towards the injured guard. "Talk to me. Where does it hurt?" "My leg. I think it's broken," Mike groaned from the floor. Sarah was at his side in an instant, her supposedly frail hands expertly and gently probing his shin. "Open fracture, tibia and fibula," she diagnosed instantly, her voice crisp and clinical. "We need a traction splint and a pressure dressing. Now." She looked up and locked eyes with David Park, the young resident. "Get me a trauma pack and 10 of morphine." The young doctor, who had been frozen in awe, snapped to attention as if zapped with a cattle prod. "Yes, ma'am." He scrambled to obey. Sarah then turned her attention back to the neutralized attacker, Tom, who was now beginning to stir, moaning on the floor. "He's in excited delirium," she barked to the room at large, which was still paralyzed in stunned silence. "His core temperature is skyrocketing. He's going to go into cardiac arrest or rhabdomyolysis if we don't get him sedated. I need 10 milligrams of ketamine IM now, and get me 4-point restraints. Move." The entire emergency department, from the residents to the veteran nurses, snapped into motion. They moved not because of her title, she had none, but because of the absolute unshakable certainty in her voice. The chaos and panic had been replaced by her iron will. She was the center of the storm, and everything revolved around her. She knelt by Tom's head, ignoring the blood and sweat, and tilted his head to ensure his airway was clear. She spoke to him, her voice once again calm and soothing. "It's okay, Tom. You're safe now. We're going to help you. Just breathe." The room was a flurry of controlled activity, a machine that had been broken and was now being expertly reassembled. And in the middle of it all was Sarah Miller, the slow, quiet, incompetent old nurse, kneeling on the floor, her hands covered in one man's blood, while she saved another's life. Dr. Preston Sterling finally emerged from behind the nursing station. He looked at the scene before him, the neutralized attacker being sedated, the hostage being comforted, the injured guard being treated. He saw his staff, his team, all moving with a purpose he had failed to provide. He saw them all looking to Sarah for direction, and he looked at Sarah, this small, insignificant woman, who had done in 90 seconds what he couldn't even begin to contemplate. The fear on his face was slowly being replaced by something far uglier, a deep, burning, pathological humiliation. He had been shown up, rendered irrelevant and cowardly in front of his entire department. His authority was shattered, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, who was to blame. His eyes narrowed, and the color returned to his cheeks in 2 angry blotches. He smoothed his pristine white coat, a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of his former self. He took a deep breath and prepared to do the only thing he knew how to do: assert his dominance and destroy the one who had threatened it. Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling. Because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. While the police secured the scene and paramedics began transporting Big Mike, Sterling made his move. He strode over to where Sarah was applying a pressure dressing to Tom's wrist, the same wrist she had broken moments before. Her touch was gentle, professional. "What, in God's name, do you think you were doing?" Sterling's voice was a low, shaking hiss of fury. Sarah didn't look up. "My job, Doctor." "Your job," he sneered, his voice rising. "Your job is to fold linens and follow orders. You are not authorized to engage hostiles. You are not authorized to practice medicine. You assaulted that man. You broke his wrist. You performed an unauthorized medical procedure." Sarah finally finished securing the dressing and looked up at him, her grey eyes cold and flat. "He was going to kill that girl, and then he was going to kill others. You were hiding behind a desk, so I did your job too." The raw truth of her words struck Sterling like a physical blow. He recoiled as if burned. The few staff members nearby who overheard the exchange fell silent, their eyes wide. "That's it," Sterling stammered, his face contorting with rage. "You're finished. You assaulted a patient. You physically attacked me when I tried to intervene." "You didn't intervene," Brenda's voice cut in. The charge nurse stepped forward, her arms crossed over her broad chest, her expression thunderous. "You coward. I saw the whole thing. We all did. She saved that girl's life." Sterling's head whipped around to face Brenda. "You will stay out of this, Thompson, or you'll be joining her in the unemployment line. I am the senior physician on duty, and I am reporting this incident. Miller acted recklessly. She is unstable. She is a danger to this hospital." He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. "You are fired. Get your things and get out. Security will escort you." He looked around for a guard, but the only ones present were busy with the official police report. His eyes landed on a junior security officer who looked terrified. "You, get her out of here." Sarah slowly got to her feet, her knee giving a loud pop. The adrenaline was fading, and the familiar aches and pains were returning, accompanied by a bone-deep weariness. She looked at Sterling, at the pathetic, desperate anger in his eyes. She looked at Brenda, who was shaking her head in disgust. She looked at Brittany, who was staring at her with a mixture of terror and awe, her hand hovering over the red line on her throat. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't fight. She simply nodded. "Fine." She turned and walked towards the staff locker room, her limp more pronounced than ever. The hero of the hour, the woman who had single-handedly prevented a massacre, was being discarded like a piece of medical waste. The silence she left in her wake was heavier and more damning than any shout. 2 hours later, the official proceeding took place in a sterile, mahogany-paneled conference room on the hospital's top floor. Sarah sat alone on one side of a long, polished table. On the other side sat Harold Pemberton, the hospital administrator, a man who seemed to sweat professionally, a stern-faced woman from Human Resources, and Dr. Preston Sterling, who looked composed and righteous, his white coat immaculate, his story rehearsed. Sarah Miller, the HR director, began, reading from a file in a monotone voice. "The charges are gross insubordination, physical assault on a patient, and practicing medicine without authorization, resulting in grievous bodily harm. Dr. Sterling has given his statement, which is corroborated by the fact that you, a registered nurse, broke a man's wrist." Pemberton wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief, avoiding Sarah's eyes. "Dr. Sterling also notes that you have been acting erratically for weeks. He feels, and the hospital must concur, that your actions tonight, while, fortunately, not resulting in a fatality, represent a severe and unacceptable liability. You put the entire hospital at risk." Sterling leaned forward, his face a mask of feigned concern. "I was attempting to de-escalate the situation verbally," he lied smoothly. "I had a plan. But Nurse Miller, in what I can only describe as a psychotic break," charged the assailant. "She was unstable. She could have gotten everyone killed. I had to have her removed for the safety of my staff." Sarah sat there and listened to the lies, one after another. She looked at her hands, which were resting on the table. The tremor was back, a visible, humiliating testament to her exhaustion and nerve damage. She looked like exactly what they were describing: an unstable, broken down old woman. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the HR director asked, her tone suggesting the answer was irrelevant. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she lifted her head and her clear grey eyes met Sterling's. "The patient, Tom, is he stable?" The question caught them off guard. Sterling blinked. "He's been sedated and is under observation. His sister has been located and is fine." "And the girl, Brittany? She's unharmed, no thanks to you," Sterling snapped. Sarah nodded slowly. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Good." She stood up, her small frame seeming to shrink under the cold fluorescent lights. "If saving their lives costs me my career, then I'll pay that price." She looked at Pemberton. "I don't need an escort. I know the way out." She turned and walked out of the room before they could officially pronounce her sentence. She left them sitting there in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. A kindly red-faced security guard named Eddie, one of Mike's friends, met her at the locker room with a cardboard box. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, looking ashamed. "This ain't right. Mike's going to be furious when he hears." "Just watch his blood pressure, Eddie," she said softly. She packed her few belongings: a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," her worn-out trauma shears, a dying succulent plant from her windowsill, and a small frame photo of a handsome young man in a navy dress uniform, her late husband. 2 decades of service, of saving lives in places both civilized and savage, reduced to a cardboard box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. Eddie walked her to the new temporary glass doors. The rain was still coming down, a cold, miserable drizzle that matched the ache in her soul. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in a blast of damp, cold air. "Take care of yourself, Dusty," Eddie said, his voice thick with emotion. She stepped out into the night. It was over. The thought wasn't angry, just a heavy, suffocating fact. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just a stubborn old nurse who didn't know her place. She'd lose her certification over this. No more nursing. Maybe she could be a greeter at a grocery store, an old woman with a limp and shaky hand saying, "Welcome to Walmart." She pulled her thin coat tighter and started the long walk to the bus stop 6 blocks away. Her car was in the shop, another expense she couldn't afford. The cardboard box grew heavier with each step, its bottom quickly becoming soggy from the rain. The photo of her husband slipped, and she fumbled to keep it from falling into a puddle. She clutched it to her chest, trying to shield it from the downpour. Her reflection in the dark window of a closed shop showed a tired, defeated old woman, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her forehead. She huddled under the meager shelter of the bus stop, the cold seeping into her bones. Her bad knee throbbed in a painful rhythm, a counterpoint to the steady drumming of the rain on the plexiglass roof. The hands that had been so steady, so lethal, just hours before were now shaking uncontrollably from the cold, the adrenaline dump, and the crushing weight of her defeat. This was her reward for a lifetime of service. A soggy box and a bus ride to oblivion. And then she heard it. It started as a low, deep thrumming, a vibration she felt in her teeth more than she heard with her ears. It was a sound that cut through the city's drone of traffic and sirens. A sound intimately familiar to her. A sound that belonged to the violent, faraway world she had tried so desperately to leave behind. Thwop, thwop, thwop. The puddles on the street began to ripple. The glass of the bus shelter vibrated against her back. The sound grew from a thrum to a roar, a deafening, chest-pounding beat that pressed down from the sky. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the rain. Through the low grey clouds, 2 shapes descended, 2 Black Hawk helicopters, their navigation lights cutting through the gloom, moving with an impossible, terrifying precision. They weren't heading for the hospital's helipad. One was circling, its searchlight sweeping the streets. The other was descending directly into the major intersection a block away. Tires screeched, cars slammed on their brakes, causing a chain reaction pile-up. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. The downdraft from the rotors hit the street like a physical blow, inverting umbrellas, sending trash cans rolling, and tearing the air with a deafening roar. Simultaneously, the street was flooded with black SUVs. They came from every direction, their tires smoking as they executed perfect J-turns, blocking all traffic, their red and blue lights washing the rainy street in a strobing, apocalyptic glare. Men in dark suits and tactical gear, Secret Service by the look of them, poured out, weapons drawn, creating a secure perimeter. Sarah stood frozen at the bus stop, clutching her box, a forgotten relic in the midst of an earth-shattering event. The searchlight from the circling helicopter swept past her, then snapped back, pinning her in its brilliant white beam. A voice crackled over a radio, loud enough for her to hear over the rotor wash. Target acquired. Eastbound bus shelter, corner of Harrison and Oakley. We have eyes on the asset. Before she could process what was happening, one of the men in suits broke from the perimeter. He sprinted through the gridlocked traffic, dodging cars, his movements economical and predatory. He was heading directly for her. He reached the bus stop, his face grim, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but laced with a desperate urgency. "Colonel Miller, you need to come with us. Now." Sarah stared at him, bewildered. Colonel. No one had called her that in a decade. "There's been a mistake," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No mistake, ma'am," the agent said, his eyes pleading. He reached for her arm. "The general is waiting. We have to go." As he spoke, the rear door of the lead SUV opened. A figure emerged, stepping out into the pouring rain as if it didn't dare touch him. He was an older man, tall and ramrod straight, wearing a simple windbreaker and jeans. He held a simple black cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it. He walked with an unmistakable air of command, flanked by two more agents, and approached the bus stop. As he got closer, the light from the helicopter glinted off the 4 silver stars on the collar of the uniform visible beneath his jacket. General Thomas Cartwright, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He stopped in front of her, his face etched with concern and a deep, familiar weariness. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in her soaked clothes, her shivering frame, and the pathetic, soggy cardboard box clutched in her arms. "You're a hard woman to track down, Ghost," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Sarah stared at him, the past and present colliding with the force of a bomb blast. The box slipped from her numb fingers, spilling its meager contents onto the wet pavement. The cracked mug shattered. The photo of her husband landed face down in a grimy puddle. The general's eyes softened with a flicker of pain. He looked at the wreckage of her civilian life, then back at her. "They told me you were fired," he said, his voice hardening into cold steel. "That ends now. We have a situation, Colonel, and I don't want the doctor. I want the medic." Back at Mercy General, Dr. Preston Sterling was standing in the brightly lit main lobby, a bank of microphones and news cameras in front of him. He was at the center of his favorite thing in the world, a press conference. He had spun the night's events into a tale of his own heroism. It was a tense and volatile situation, he was saying, his voice resonating with false modesty and practiced authority. But thanks to the swift and decisive protocols I implemented, my team was able to contain the threat with minimal injury. The assailant was subdued, and the hostage was rescued unharmed. A reporter shouted a question. "Doctor, there are rumors that a nurse was fired following the incident. Can you comment on that?" Sterling's face settled into a mask of solemn regret. "Regrettably, yes. A long-time nurse who I'm afraid had been showing signs of instability acted against my direct orders. Her reckless actions escalated the situation and endangered my staff. For the safety of our patients, I had to make the difficult decision to terminate her employment. Our hospital has a zero-tolerance policy for such behavior." He was about to continue when a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. The temporary doors were flung open, and General Cartwright strode in, flanked by a wall of grim-faced federal agents. Sarah trailed behind him, soaked and shivering, looking small and utterly out of place. Harold Pemberton, the administrator, rushed forward, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. "General, what is this? This is a private hospital," Pemberton sputtered. Cartwright ignored him completely. His eyes were locked on Sterling, who had frozen mid-sentence, his mouth agape. The cameras all swiveled away from the doctor and focused on the four-star general who had just crashed the party. "I was watching your press conference on my way over, Doctor," Cartwright said, his voice dangerously quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the lobby. He came to a stop directly in front of Sterling. "You just told the nation that a mentally unstable nurse was fired for escalating a crisis." That is correct, General," Sterling stammered, trying to regain his composure. "She was a danger." "A danger," Cartwright repeated, the words dripping with ice. He turned to one of his agents, who handed him a sleek black tablet. He held it up, its screen showing crystal-clear security footage from the ER. It showed Sterling cowering behind the desk. It showed Sarah's calm, tactical advance. It showed her disarming a man twice her size with brutal balletic efficiency. "I've reviewed the security footage and the telemetry data from your monitors, Doctor," the general continued, his voice rising with cold fury. "The first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch in Afghanistan would have spotted the signs of excited delirium. When your staff was panicking and you were hiding, that unstable nurse was the only person in this building who knew what to do. When you attempted to assert your non-existent authority, she ignored you, and in doing so, she saved the lives of at least 3 people tonight, one of whom happens to be my godson." A collective gasp went through the lobby. Sterling's face drained of all color, leaving it a sickly, waxy white. He looked as if he'd been turned to stone. Cartwright wasn't finished. He tapped the screen, and a new file appeared, a military service record. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is, Doctor?" he asked, his voice now a low growl. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to read, his voice ringing with pride and fury. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Ghost Miller, United States Army Medical Corps, formerly attached to Joint Special Operations Command. 6 tours of duty, 3 in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan. Specialty: Special Operations Combat Trauma. Recipient of the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 2 Purple Hearts." He looked up from the tablet, his eyes boring into Sterling. "They call her Ghost because on a mission in the Hindu Kush, her Black Hawk went down. She was the only medic for a team of 12 wounded operators. For 3 days, under enemy fire, she kept every single one of them alive until extraction. Every single one." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You want to know about her instability? That tremor in her hands you and your residents like to joke about? That's permanent nerve damage from holding direct pressure on a soldier's severed femoral artery for 6 hours in a ditch outside Fallujah, refusing evacuation for herself until a replacement medic arrived. That limp. That's from the shrapnel that shattered her knee in Kandahar when she used her own body to shield a wounded ranger from a mortar blast. She's not unstable, Doctor. She is a decorated national hero who you just slandered on live television." The silence in the lobby was absolute, broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. Sterling stood there, his jaw slack, his carefully constructed world shattered into a million pieces. The veneer of his arrogance had been sand-blasted away, revealing the terrified, incompetent little man beneath. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. General Cartwright turned his withering gaze on the sweating, trembling administrator. "Mr. Pemberton, this hospital has federal funding. My godson is a patient here. A national hero in your employ was assaulted, fired, and defamed for doing her job. You're about to be the subject of a federal investigation into malpractice, insurance fraud, and about a dozen other things my lawyers are currently drawing up. I suggest you start making better decisions. Immediately." Pemberton, his face the color of ash, looked from the furious general to the ruined doctor. He made the only calculation a man like him could make. He abandoned the sinking ship. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pre-written letter. It was Sterling's termination letter, prepared just in case. "Dr. Sterling," Pemberton said, his voice shaking, "effective immediately. Your privileges at this hospital are suspended pending a full board review and the results of the federal investigation. Please clear out your locker." Sterling stared at him, his eyes wide with betrayal. "What? You can't? My father." "Your father can't help you now," Cartwright said coldly. "He's on the phone with the Secretary of Defense as we speak, trying to explain how his son almost let my godson die, and then fired the one person who could save him." And then came the final, perfect moment of symbolic justice. Big Mike, his leg in a temporary cast, was wheeled into the lobby by another guard. He had insisted on being there. In his lap was a small, empty cardboard box. Eddie, the guard who had escorted Sarah out, took the box and walked up to the now catatonic Dr. Sterling. He held it out. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Eddie said, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "It's a bit small, but I think you'll manage." Sterling stared at the box, the same vessel of shame he had forced upon Sarah. He stumbled backward, shaking his head, and then he turned and fled, pushing through the throng of reporters, a pathetic, broken figure running from the ruins of his life. He burst out into the cold, driving rain, without a coat, without his dignity, cameras flashing in his face as he disappeared into the darkness. Sarah had watched the entire scene from the edge of the room, silent and still. She felt no triumph, no joy, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The war at home had been just as brutal as the ones she had fought overseas. The general walked over to her, his expression softening. "It's over, Colonel." She looked up at him, her grey eyes filled with a profound exhaustion. "It's Sarah now, Tom. Just Sarah." He nodded, understanding. "The administrator has offered you any position you want. Director of Nursing, Chief of Trauma Training. Name your price." Sarah looked around the lobby, at the faces of the nurses and residents who were now staring at her with a reverence usually reserved for saints. She saw Brittany Moore weeping silently in a corner. She saw Brenda Thompson, a look of fierce, unadulterated pride on her face. "I don't want a title," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to change things. I want a hospital where the person who cleans the floors has a voice if they see something wrong, where competence matters more than credentials, where a nurse can save a life without losing their job." The general smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "Then that's what you'll get. Write the protocols, Colonel. We'll make them law." 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the new glass entrance of Mercy General Hospital. A large polished brass plaque was being unveiled. It read, "The Colonel Sarah Ghost, Miller Center for Crisis Response and Patient Advocacy." Sarah stood at the podium, not in her old, oversized scrubs, but in a simple, well-fitting dress, her hair down. She looked peaceful. The tremor in her hands was still there, a permanent reminder of her past, but she no longer tried to hide it. Her limp was a part of her stride, not a sign of weakness. In the front row sat General Cartwright, smiling proudly. Beside him was a healthy-looking young man named Tom, with his sister Jessica. Nearby, Big Mike stood tall, leaning only slightly on a cane. Brenda, now the Director of Nursing, her official title, winked at Sarah from the crowd. Sarah looked out at the assembled staff. The culture of fear was gone, replaced by a culture of respect. A young resident, nervous and eager, had just asked her a question about a difficult case, not with fear of rebuke, but with a genuine desire to learn. She saw herself in his uncertainty. "A title on a door doesn't make you a leader," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "Authority isn't granted by a board. It's earned by the trust of your patients and your team. This center is named for a nurse, not just to honor me, but as a promise that from this day forward, in this hospital, the patient always comes first. always. And if you have to break a rule to save a life, you do it. I will have your back. A roar of applause went up from the crowd, a sound of genuine, heartfelt gratitude. As she stepped away from the podium, a young nurse, a new hire, barely out of school, approached her nervously. "Colonel Miller, ma'am, Thank you," the young woman stammered. "You're the reason I wanted to work here." Sarah looked at the young nurse's bright, hopeful face and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Just protect your patients," she said, her voice soft. "That's all that matters." As for Dr. Preston Sterling, he was never heard from in a hospital again. His license was permanently revoked. The last anyone heard, he was managing a cosmetic Botox clinic in a strip mall in suburban Ohio. His name tag crooked, his once steady hands now shaking as he checked expiration dates, forever looking over his shoulder, as if haunted by a ghost. And that is the incredible story of Colonel Sarah Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now, getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.